The taxi rolled slowly through a quiet neighborhood in the northern suburbs of Seattle, passing rows of maple trees and identical brick houses with carefully trimmed lawns. Late afternoon sunlight reflected off the windows, giving the peaceful street an almost postcard-like appearance. In the back seat sat Margaret Hayes, a woman in her mid-60s whose posture still carried the quiet confidence of someone who had spent decades standing in front of classrooms. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and a navy coat rested across her knees beside a leather briefcase that had traveled with her to countless academic conferences over the years. The driver stopped in front of a two-story house with white shutters and a small wooden porch. Margaret glanced at the address again, even though she knew it by heart. It was her son Daniel's home, the place where her two grandchildren lived. "Here we are," the driver said. Margaret smiled politely and paid the fare before stepping out into the crisp autumn air. The trip from Denver had been long, but she barely felt the fatigue. The conference she had attended had been important. After 42 years teaching history at a university, she had received a Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Academic Society. It had been an emotional ceremony filled with applause, handshakes, and speeches praising her dedication to education. Yet the person she had been most excited to tell was not any of her colleagues. It was her grandchildren. 10-year-old Sophie and 8-year-old Oliver had always been curious children who loved stories about history and science. Margaret often imagined their wide eyes when she described ancient cities or famous explorers. She wanted them to know that their grandmother had done something meaningful with her life, something worth remembering. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the front door. Lights were glowing inside the house. Someone was home. Margaret rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the hallway. The door swung open, and Sophie appeared, her curly hair bouncing as she threw her arms around Margaret's waist. "Grandma, you came." Margaret laughed softly and hugged her tightly. "Of course I came," she said warmly. "I promised, didn't I?" From the staircase behind them came the thunder of smaller footsteps. Oliver rushed down the stairs and crashed into the hug as well. "Grandma, did you bring stories from your trip?" "I always do," Margaret replied, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. A moment later, Daniel appeared from the kitchen doorway. He was in his early 40s now, though Margaret could still see the boy she had raised alone after his father disappeared decades earlier. His expression carried a mix of surprise and mild discomfort.
"Hi, Mom," he said.
"Hello, Daniel." They hugged briefly. It was polite but distant, the kind of embrace shared by people who loved each other but had grown used to a quiet tension they never quite addressed. "How was the conference?" he asked. Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but another voice interrupted from the kitchen. "Kids, give your grandmother some space. She just arrived." Emily walked into the hallway, wiping her hands on a dish towel. She was tall and elegant, dressed casually but perfectly put together, the way people often looked when they wanted to appear effortlessly organized. Her smile was polite, too polite. "Hello, Margaret," she said. "Hello, Emily." The tension between the two women had existed for nearly 12 years, ever since Daniel had introduced Emily during his final year at college. At first, Margaret assumed the distance was simply the awkwardness that sometimes appeared in new family relationships. But over time it had become something colder, something intentional. Emily never argued openly. She never raised her voice. But she created barriers. Missed invitations. Suddenly changed schedules. Phone calls that went unanswered. Visits that were somehow always inconvenient. Margaret had learned long ago that the easiest way to maintain peace was to remain calm and polite, especially in front of the children. "We're making dinner," Emily said. "Roast chicken. You're welcome to stay if you want." The sentence sounded like an obligation rather than an invitation. "I'd be happy to," Margaret replied gently. Daniel took her suitcase and carried it upstairs to the guest room while Sophie and Oliver eagerly pulled Margaret into the living room to show her school drawings and science projects. That was when Margaret noticed the album. It sat on the coffee table, large, leather-bound, with elegant gold lettering on the cover that read Our Family Memories. "What's this?" Margaret asked, picking it up. "Oh," Sophie said proudly. "Mom made it. It has pictures of everything, birthdays, holidays, vacations." Margaret smiled and opened the album. The first pages were exactly what she expected. Wedding photos of Daniel and Emily. Pictures of newborn Sophie wrapped in a pink blanket. Oliver's first birthday cake, smeared across his cheeks. Family vacations by the ocean. School plays. Christmas mornings. But after a few pages, Margaret's smile slowly faded. In several photos there were strange empty spaces, areas where the background looked uneven, as if someone had been carefully removed. Margaret turned another page. A photograph from Sophie's 7th birthday showed Daniel standing beside the cake. On the other side of him was a noticeable gap, an awkward stretch of wall where someone clearly should have been standing. Margaret remembered that day clearly. She had been there. She had baked the cake herself. Her heart began to beat faster as she flipped through more pages. The pattern continued. Thanksgiving dinner. Christmas morning. A school graduation. Every group photo had the same odd emptiness, where Margaret knew she had once stood. Someone had carefully cut her out, removed her presence as if she had never been there. Then Margaret reached the final page. Written in delicate black ink beneath a decorative border were the words, "Some people don't deserve to be part of family memories." Margaret slowly lifted her eyes. Emily was standing in the doorway, watching. Her expression was calm, almost satisfied. The children had already run upstairs to wash their hands before dinner. The house had grown quiet. Margaret closed the album gently and placed it back on the table. "Why?" she asked quietly. Emily folded her arms. "You know why." "No," Margaret said softly. "I don't." Emily stepped forward, her voice cold but controlled. "Because a real grandmother would actually be around," she said. "A real grandmother would put family before a career." Margaret felt the words settle like ice in her chest. Daniel returned from upstairs just in time to hear the last sentence. His face turned pale when he noticed the album on the table. "Mom." "I can explain," he said quickly. Margaret looked at him. The boy she had worked 2 jobs to raise. The boy whose college tuition she had paid with years of savings. "You knew about this?" Daniel didn't answer immediately. Emily did. "It was my idea," she said calmly. But he agreed that the children deserve better role models. For a moment Margaret said nothing. Then she stood slowly, picked up her purse, and walked toward the staircase. Her voice was steady when she spoke again. "If you think you can erase me," she said quietly, "then we'll see how well that works." Neither Daniel nor Emily understood what she meant. But Margaret already did. And somewhere deep inside her mind, a plan had begun to form. That night, long after everyone else had gone to bed, Margaret sat in the guest room staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly above her. Years of teaching students how to research and analyze evidence had taught her one thing. Truth was powerful. And sometimes the truth needed to be delivered at exactly the right moment. She already knew what she would do. All she needed now was the right envelope. Morning light crept slowly through the kitchen windows of Daniel Bennett's house, casting long stripes across the wooden floor. The house was unusually quiet for a weekday morning. Daniel had already left for work before sunrise, leaving behind the faint smell of coffee and the soft hum of the refrigerator. Upstairs, Sophie and Oliver were still getting dressed for school, their muffled voices drifting faintly through the ceiling. Margaret Hayes was already awake. She had barely slept. The discovery of the album the night before had stirred something deep inside her, something far beyond simple hurt. For years she had sensed a distance growing between herself and her grandchildren, but she had blamed circumstances, busy schedules, long distances, the natural complications of modern family life. Now she realized it had never been accidental. Emily had been building those walls piece by piece. Margaret poured herself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the steam rising from the mug. Her mind moved carefully through memories, re-examining years of small incidents that had once seemed harmless, but now felt like clues in a much larger pattern. Missed birthday invitations, phone calls that were never returned, packages that seemed to vanish without explanation. Each moment had been easy to dismiss at the time, but together they formed something unmistakable. Someone had been making sure Margaret stayed at a distance. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. Emily entered the kitchen dressed neatly in a pale sweater and black slacks, her hair tied back with the same perfect composure she always carried. "Coffee?" Margaret asked calmly. Emily shook her head. "I already had some." For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence was thick but controlled, like two chess players studying a board before making their next move. Margaret broke it first. "You went through the trouble of cutting me out of every photograph," she said quietly. "That must have taken a lot of time." Emily didn't look surprised. "It was necessary." "For what?" "To protect my children." Margaret studied her carefully. "From me?" Emily finally met her eyes. "Yes." The bluntness of the answer might have shocked someone else. Margaret only nodded slowly, absorbing the words. Before she could respond, Sophie and Oliver rushed into the kitchen wearing their backpacks. "Grandma, are you leaving today?" Oliver asked. "After breakfast," Margaret replied with a warm smile. Sophie frowned slightly. "I wish you could stay longer." Margaret opened her mouth to answer, but Emily spoke first. "Grandma is very busy," she said lightly. "She has important work to do." The tone sounded harmless, but Margaret heard the implication behind it. She placed her coffee cup down carefully. "Well," she said, "I was actually thinking of visiting your school before I leave. I'd love to see your classrooms." Emily stiffened slightly. "Visitors usually need permission," she said. Margaret smiled politely. "I called the office earlier this morning," she replied. "Daniel added me to the approved family list years ago. They said I'm welcome anytime." Emily said nothing. 10 minutes later they were all in the car. The drive to the elementary school passed mostly in silence. Sophie and Oliver chatted excitedly about upcoming class projects while Emily focused on the road, her hands gripping the steering wheel more tightly than usual. Margaret watched the neighborhood pass by through the window. Her expression remained calm, but her thoughts were moving quickly. If Emily had truly been interfering with her relationship with the children for years, then there had to be proof somewhere. Teachers noticed things. School staff noticed things. Children talked more openly at school than adults often realized. When they arrived, Sophie and Oliver jumped out of the car and ran toward the entrance. Margaret hugged them both. "I'll see you inside," she said. Emily forced a smile. "We're running late, but I suppose it's fine." Margaret waited until they disappeared into the building before walking toward the administrative office. Inside, a receptionist greeted her warmly. "Good morning. My name is Margaret Hayes," she said politely. "I'm Sophie and Oliver Bennett's grandmother. I was hoping to speak with their teachers for a moment, if they're available." The receptionist checked the schedule. "I think Mrs. Carter has a planning period right now. Let me see if she can meet with you." A few minutes later, Margaret was seated in a small classroom across from Sophie's fourth-grade teacher. Mrs. Carter smiled kindly. "Sophie talks about you often," she said. Margaret blinked in surprise. "She does?" "Oh, yes," the teacher replied. "She once brought a book about famous women in history for show and tell and said her grandmother gave it to her." Margaret felt a small wave of emotion rise in her chest. She had mailed that book almost 6 months earlier. "I didn't realize she received it," Margaret admitted quietly. Mrs. Carter's expression shifted slightly. "I assumed you had given it to her personally." Margaret hesitated before asking the question that had begun forming in her mind. "Has Sophie ever mentioned why I don't visit very often?" Mrs. Carter nodded slowly. "She once said you're usually too busy with work." Margaret lowered her gaze. "That's not true," she said softly. Mrs. Carter seemed to sense there was more to the story, but didn't press further. After thanking the teacher, Margaret visited Oliver's classroom as well. His teachers shared similar comments. Oliver often spoke about his grandmother, but believed she canceled visits frequently because she was busy traveling. By the time Margaret left the school, the pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together. Emily hadn't simply distanced her. She had rewritten the story of their relationship entirely. Margaret walked slowly down the sidewalk toward a small cafe on the corner. Inside, a woman with short gray hair was already waiting at a table near the window. Janet Collins looked up from a stack of papers and smiled. "You look like someone who hasn't slept," she said bluntly. Margaret sat down across from her old friend. "That obvious?" Janet pushed a folder across the table. "I made a few calls this morning after your message." Margaret opened the folder carefully. Inside were printed screenshots from social media accounts, Emily's posts, photographs of the children, captions describing how disappointed Sophie and Oliver were when Grandma canceled another visit, or Grandma was too busy to come again. Margaret stared at the pages in silence. "I never canceled any visits," she said quietly. "I figured," Janet replied. "There's more." She pointed to another section of the folder. "I spoke with your neighbor, Mrs. Turner, the one who collects your mail when you travel." Margaret looked up. "What about her?" "She said several packages addressed to Daniel's house were returned to your doorstep while you were at conferences." Margaret's stomach tightened. "Returned?" Janet nodded. "She kept them in her storage room. Thought you might want them." For a long moment Margaret said nothing. Then she whispered, "The birthday gifts." "Probably. And the Christmas presents." "Most likely." Margaret closed the folder slowly. All the unanswered questions of the past few years suddenly had explanations. The missing thank you calls. The confused reactions from the children when she mentioned gifts they didn't remember receiving. Emily hadn't just been distancing her. She had been intercepting everything. Why would someone do that? Margaret asked quietly. Janet leaned back in her chair. "Because control can be addictive," she said. "Some people can't tolerate sharing emotional space." Margaret stared out the cafe window at the passing traffic. Her hurt slowly hardened into something steadier. Determination. "What are you going to do?" Janet asked. Margaret exhaled slowly. "I'm going to gather every piece of evidence I can find." Janet raised an eyebrow. "And then?" Margaret's voice became calm and precise, the same tone she used when presenting arguments to a lecture hall full of students. "Then I'm going to make sure the truth reaches everyone who needs to hear it." Later that afternoon, Margaret returned to her apartment building downtown. Mrs. Turner greeted her immediately from the hallway. "Oh, good, you're back," the older woman said. "I saved those packages for you." Within minutes, Margaret found herself surrounded by a stack of unopened boxes and padded envelopes. Books, educational games, handwritten letters, birthday cards. Each one had been returned while she was traveling. Each one had never reached the children they were meant for. Margaret sat on the floor among the packages for a long time, examining the labels and dates. Years of love had been quietly redirected back to her doorstep. That evening, she cleared her dining table and began organizing everything carefully. Receipts, shipping confirmations, screenshots, witness statements, photographs. The pile grew steadily larger. By midnight, a thick manila envelope lay in the center of the table. Margaret sealed it carefully. Her face was calm again. The hurt had not disappeared, but now it had purpose. And somewhere in the coming weeks, at the right moment and in the right place, that envelope would change everything. Over the next 2 weeks, Margaret Hayes worked with the same methodical discipline that had guided her through decades of academic research. She treated the situation not as an emotional conflict, but as a case study that required careful documentation, verification, and structure. Every afternoon after finishing her lectures at the university, she returned to her apartment and continued assembling the materials that would eventually fill the envelope resting on her desk. The dining table had transformed into something that resembled an investigator's workspace. Neatly labeled folders spread across the polished wood surface. Each one contained a different category of information. One held photographs of returned packages collected from Mrs. Turner. Another contained printed screenshots of social media posts where Emily described Margaret as an absent grandmother who rarely had time for family. A third folder held copies of bank transfers Margaret had made over the years, financial support she had quietly provided to Daniel and Emily when they purchased their house, when Daniel lost his job during a company restructuring, and when the grandchildren's college savings accounts were opened. Margaret had never intended to use those documents against anyone. For years, she had viewed those gestures simply as a mother's responsibility to support her family when necessary. But the narrative Emily had created painted a very different image of Margaret, one of indifference, selfish ambition, and emotional distance. If Margaret was going to confront that narrative, she needed something stronger than words. She needed facts. Janet visited several times during those weeks, bringing her sharp investigative instincts to the process. "You're building quite the case," Janet said one afternoon as she reviewed a stack of printed emails. "I'm not building a case," Margaret replied calmly. "I'm organizing the truth." Janet smirked slightly. "Same thing, depending on who you ask." Margaret didn't respond. She continued arranging the documents carefully into chronological order. There was one more step she needed to take before revealing anything. She needed to speak with Daniel. The phone call happened on a quiet Tuesday evening. Daniel answered after the third ring. "Mom, is everything okay?" His voice carried a trace of concern, but also hesitation. Since the evening Margaret had discovered the album, their conversations had been brief and cautious. "We need to talk," Margaret said. A pause followed. "About what happened?" he asked quietly.
"Yes."
"But not over the phone." Daniel sighed softly. "Emily and I have been very busy lately." "Daniel," Margaret interrupted gently. "This is important." Another pause stretched across the line. Finally he said, "All right." "When?" "Friday evening. Dinner. Just you and me." There was another silence. "I don't know if Emily will be comfortable with that," he admitted. "This conversation isn't about Emily," Margaret said calmly. "It's about you and me." Daniel hesitated again. "Okay," he said eventually. They agreed to meet at Antonio's, a small Italian restaurant Daniel had loved since childhood. Margaret used to take him there to celebrate good report cards or achievements in school. It felt appropriate to return there now. Friday evening arrived with cool autumn air and a quiet drizzle that left the streets glistening under the city lights. Margaret arrived early and chose a table near the window. She placed her purse beside her chair and waited. Daniel entered 15 minutes later. He looked tired. Dark circles rested beneath his eyes, and his shoulders carried the subtle heaviness of someone who hadn't been sleeping well. They exchanged an awkward hug before sitting down. "You look good, Mom," Daniel said. "You look exhausted," Margaret replied honestly. He gave a small, tired smile. The waiter brought menus, but neither of them looked at them for long. After ordering their meals, Daniel leaned back in his chair. "So," he said carefully, "what did you want to talk about?" Margaret placed her purse on the table and removed a thin folder. Daniel's eyes immediately shifted toward it. "What's that?" "Something you need to see." She slid the folder across the table. Daniel opened it slowly. Inside were printed screenshots of Emily's social media posts. Daniel read the first one silently, then the second, then the third. Each one described a moment when Sophie or Oliver had supposedly been disappointed because their grandmother canceled another visit. Daniel frowned. "I don't understand," he said. Margaret watched him carefully. "Because I never canceled those visits." Daniel's eyebrows tightened. "But Emily said." "I know what Emily said." Margaret placed another sheet on the table. It was a photograph of 3 returned packages with shipping labels clearly visible. Daniel stared at it. "These were sent to your house," Margaret explained. "They were returned to my doorstep while I was traveling." Daniel looked genuinely confused. "I never saw these." Margaret slid another document toward him. Shipping receipts. Dates. Tracking numbers. Proof of delivery attempts. Daniel leaned forward, scanning the papers more quickly now. His confusion slowly shifted toward something darker. "Mom, this could be a misunderstanding," he said quietly. Margaret remained calm. "Then explain the letters." She placed several printed emails on the table. Each one was addressed to Daniel. Each one asked about visiting the children. None had ever received replies. "I never got these," Daniel said immediately. "They were sent to your email address." Daniel ran a hand through his hair. I don't remember seeing them." Margaret watched him carefully. For years she had taught students how to recognize denial. Daniel wasn't lying, but he also hadn't been paying attention.
"There's more," she said.
She removed another set of papers. Bank statements. Daniel recognized them immediately. "Mom, why are you showing me this?" "These are the financial transfers I made to help you over the years." Daniel's expression softened slightly. "You didn't have to keep records of that." "I didn't," Margaret said quietly. "Until recently." Daniel's voice dropped. "You think Emily is behind all this?" Margaret didn't answer directly. "What do you think?" Daniel stared down at the table. Silence stretched between them. Finally, he spoke again. "Emily had a difficult childhood," he said slowly. "Her mother was very critical. Her father remarried quickly after the divorce, and Emily always felt like an outsider in her own family." Margaret listened carefully. "She's terrified of her children feeling abandoned," Daniel continued. "She thinks people who focus too much on their careers can't be present for family." Margaret leaned forward slightly. "Daniel," she said gently, "did I ever abandon you?" Daniel looked up immediately.
"No."
"Did I ever stop loving you because I worked long hours?"
"No."
"Then why would I abandon your children?" Daniel had no answer. The waiter arrived with their food, but neither of them touched it. Daniel finally pushed his plate aside. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. Margaret folded her hands. "I want you to see what's happening." Daniel's voice lowered. "If Emily really did these things." Margaret waited. "Then it changes everything," he finished. Margaret nodded slowly. "That's why I'm telling you now." Daniel looked back at the documents. "Please don't confront her yet," he said suddenly. Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You've had 11 years to confront her. I just need time to talk to her." Margaret stood slowly, picking up the folder. "Daniel," she said calmly, "I've already given this situation more than a decade of patience."
She paused.
"The time for quiet conversations is over." Daniel's eyes widened slightly. "What are you planning?" Margaret picked up her purse. "You'll find out soon enough." She walked toward the restaurant exit, leaving Daniel staring at the documents still spread across the table. Outside, the rain had stopped. Margaret walked slowly down the sidewalk, her mind already moving ahead. The envelope on her desk was nearly complete, but she wasn't going to deliver it privately. Truth, she believed, was most powerful when revealed in the presence of everyone who had been affected by the lie. And very soon there would be the perfect opportunity. A school science fair, followed by a family dinner. The ideal audience. The ideal moment. By the time Margaret reached her car, her decision had fully solidified. Within days, that envelope would be opened. And once it was, no one in the family would ever see things the same way again. The elementary school gymnasium buzzed with the restless excitement that only a room full of children could create. Folding tables stretched across the polished wooden floor, each one covered with brightly colored posters, cardboard models, and handwritten reports. Parents moved slowly between the displays, stopping to read explanations while proud students stood beside their projects like young scientists presenting groundbreaking discoveries. Margaret Hayes paused near the entrance and scanned the room. She spotted Oliver almost immediately. He stood beside a large papier-mâché volcano painted in dark shades of red and black. Small labels pointed to different parts of the model, and a neatly typed report rested on the table beside it. Oliver was adjusting the edge of the display board, his tongue slightly sticking out in concentration. Next to him stood Emily. She looked perfectly composed, wearing a cream-colored blouse and a dark skirt that made her appear more like a business executive than a parent attending a school science fair. Her posture was stiff, her expression carefully controlled as she watched Oliver fuss over his project. Daniel was nowhere in sight. Margaret took a slow breath and began walking across the gym. Oliver looked up first. His face brightened instantly. "Grandma." He rushed forward and wrapped his arms around her waist. Margaret hugged him tightly, her heart warming at the simple, genuine affection. "I'm so glad you came," he said. "I wouldn't miss it," she replied softly. Emily turned slowly toward them. The polite smile on her face looked more forced than ever.
"Margaret," she said.
"Emily." Their greeting was brief and cool. Margaret turned back to Oliver. "Now," she said, leaning closer to the table, "tell me about this impressive volcano." Oliver's excitement returned immediately. For the next 15 minutes, he eagerly explained every part of the project. He described how he had built the structure with layers of paper and glue, how baking soda and vinegar created the eruption, and how he had researched real volcanic activity to understand how magma traveled beneath the Earth's surface. Margaret listened with full attention, occasionally asking thoughtful questions that made Oliver's eyes light up even more. "You've done excellent work," she told him sincerely. Oliver grinned proudly. "Dad helped me paint it," he said. "But I did all the science." "Of course you did," Margaret replied warmly. Emily checked her phone. "Your father texted," she said. "He's running late." Oliver's smile faded slightly. "He promised he'd be here." "Work meetings run long sometimes," Emily replied lightly. Margaret noticed the irony immediately. For years, Emily had used that same explanation to criticize Margaret's career. But Margaret said nothing. Instead, she opened her briefcase. "I brought you something," she said, handing Oliver a small package wrapped in silver paper. Emily's head snapped up. "We don't usually do gifts at school events." "It relates to his project," Margaret said calmly. Oliver had already torn open the wrapping. Inside was a hardcover book titled Volcanoes Around the World. Large photographs filled the pages, showing dramatic eruptions, lava flows, and towering mountains of ash and rock. "Whoa," Oliver whispered, flipping through the pages. "There's also something written inside," Margaret said. Oliver opened the front cover. Inside, Margaret had written, "To Oliver, whose curiosity and determination will take him farther than any volcano ever could. With love, Grandma." Oliver traced the words with his finger. "Thank you," he said quietly. Emily reached out her hand. "Let me put that in my bag, so it doesn't get damaged." Before Oliver could respond, the school principal's voice echoed through the gym. "Judging will begin in 5 minutes." Oliver hurried back to his project, clutching the book proudly against his chest. Margaret watched him for a moment. Then Emily stepped closer. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. Margaret met her gaze. "Being a grandmother." Emily's jaw tightened. Before she could respond, Daniel hurried into the gym. His hair was slightly messy, and he looked like he had rushed straight from work. "Did I miss the judging?" he asked. "It's just starting," Emily replied stiffly. Daniel nodded and turned toward Oliver. Margaret noticed the questioning glance he gave her when he saw the book in Oliver's hands. But he said nothing. The judges eventually reached Oliver's table. He confidently explained the project, and even used the book Margaret had given him to show examples of real volcanic eruptions. When the announcements were made later, Oliver received an honorable mention. It wasn't first place, but he beamed with pride anyway. Margaret applauded louder than anyone. After the event ended, Emily reminded everyone about the dinner planned at their house that evening. "My parents are coming," she said. "We're celebrating their anniversary and Oliver's science fair." Then she looked at Margaret. "You're welcome to join us." The invitation sounded forced, but Margaret simply nodded. "Thank you." The drive to the house took 20 minutes. Margaret followed their car, her briefcase resting on the passenger seat beside her. Inside it lay the envelope, carefully organized, carefully prepared, carefully timed. When she arrived, Emily's parents were already there. Donald and Marilyn Brooks greeted everyone warmly. They were polite people, though Margaret had only met them a handful of times over the years. Dinner began quietly. Emily led most of the conversation, praising her parents' 40 years of marriage and emphasizing the importance of being present for family. Margaret noticed Daniel growing increasingly uncomfortable. Finally, dessert arrived, a cake decorated with the words "Congratulations, Oliver," and "Happy Anniversary." Donald lifted his glass.
To family, he said.
Everyone echoed the toast. Margaret placed her fork down. "Before we continue," she said calmly, "I have something I'd like to share." The room fell silent. She reached into her briefcase and placed the manila envelope in the center of the table. "This is for you, Emily." Emily stared at it suspiciously. "What is it?" "Evidence," Margaret replied. Emily hesitated before opening the envelope. Inside were several folders, each neatly labeled. Returned packages, intercepted messages, financial support, false claims, teacher statements. Emily's face slowly lost color as she flipped through the first folder. "What is this?"
Donald asked.
Margaret spoke calmly. "For years, Emily has intercepted gifts, hidden letters, canceled visits I never knew about, and told my grandchildren that I chose my career over them." Emily slammed the folder closed. "That's ridiculous." Margaret turned towards Sophie and Oliver. "Did you receive the birthday presents I sent last year?" she asked gently. Sophie looked confused. "You sent presents?" "Yes." Oliver spoke next. "What about the dinosaur book you gave me a long time ago?" Daniel frowned. "What dinosaur book?" "The one I read once and then couldn't find again," Oliver said. He turned toward Emily. "You said I lost it." Emily's face flushed. "It was too advanced for him," she said defensively. "That wasn't your decision to make," Daniel replied. Donald stepped forward slowly. "Rebecca, is this true?" Emily said nothing. Daniel picked up another folder. His face darkened as he read through the documents. Emails Margaret had sent that he never received. Photographs of returned packages. Shipping records. Bank transfers. "Mom helped us with the house down payment," Daniel said quietly. "Why didn't you tell me it was this much?" Emily looked trapped. "She's trying to manipulate you," she said. Margaret remained calm. "I'm presenting the truth." The silence that followed filled the entire room. Finally, Sophie spoke. "Mom, did you really tell us Grandma canceled visits that she never canceled?" Emily didn't answer, but she didn't deny it either. Daniel stood up slowly. "We need to talk." Emily's voice trembled. "So, everyone's against me now?" "This isn't about sides," Daniel said. "It's about honesty." Margaret quietly gathered the folders back into the envelope. The truth had finally been spoken. But the consequences were only just beginning. The silence that settled over the dining room felt heavier than any argument. No one spoke for several seconds after Daniel's words. The air seemed thick, filled with the weight of things that had been hidden for years and had now finally surfaced all at once. The folders lay scattered across the table like fragments of a story no one in the room had expected to hear. Sophie and Oliver stood near the doorway, unsure whether they were supposed to stay or leave. Their eyes moved nervously between the adults. Emily remained standing beside her chair. Her composure, which she had maintained so carefully for years, was visibly cracking. Her hands trembled slightly, though she tried to hide it by gripping the edge of the table. "This is unbelievable," she said finally, though her voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. Margaret did not respond immediately. She had not brought the envelope to create a shouting match. She had brought it so the truth would exist openly, where no one could pretend not to see it. Daniel was the one who spoke next. "Emily," he said quietly, "did you hide my mother's gifts?" Emily stared at him. "You're really going to do this in front of everyone?" Daniel didn't look away. "Did you?" Her silence stretched long enough to become its own answer. Oliver shifted uncomfortably. "Dad, does that mean Grandma really did send me presents?" Daniel looked down at his son. Yes, he said softly. Oliver's small face tightened with confusion. Then why didn't we get them? No one answered immediately. Emily's parents exchanged troubled glances. Donald, who had remained mostly quiet throughout the evening, stepped forward slowly. Emily, he said carefully, we need to understand what's happening here. Emily shook her head. You're all acting like I'm some kind of criminal. No one said that, Daniel replied. But you're treating me like one. Her voice rose slightly, though it was clear the anger came from a place deeper than simple defensiveness. You don't understand what it's like, she continued. Growing up with a mother who was never there. Being sent to relatives who didn't want you. Feeling like you were always competing with someone else's priorities. Margaret watched her quietly. For the first time, Emily's words carried something raw and genuine rather than calculated. When Daniel and I had children, Emily continued, I promised myself they would never feel second place to anyone's career. Margaret spoke gently. And you believed I would make them feel that way? Emily laughed bitterly. You missed birthday parties, school plays. Because I wasn't told about them, Margaret said calmly. Emily's eyes flickered. Margaret continued. I was given the wrong dates. Or no dates at all. Daniel looked sharply toward Emily. Is that true? Emily didn't answer. Sophie suddenly stepped forward. I remember the museum trip, she said quietly. Everyone turned toward her. You told me Grandma canceled, Sophie said to her mother. But she didn't, did she? Emily looked at her daughter and seemed unable to find the words. Sophie's voice trembled slightly. I cried that day because I thought she didn't want to see me. Margaret felt a sharp ache in her chest. Years of missed moments had suddenly condensed into one painful sentence spoken by a 10-year-old. Daniel rubbed his forehead slowly. I should have noticed, he murmured. Margaret looked at him. You trusted your wife, she said gently. That's not a crime. Daniel shook his head. But ignoring things because they're uncomfortable is. Emily crossed her arms again, though her earlier confidence had disappeared. So what now? She asked bitterly. Everyone decides I'm the villain? Margaret answered quietly. No. Emily looked surprised. What I want, Margaret continued, is honesty. Daniel nodded slowly. And change, he added. Emily laughed softly, though the sound lacked humor. So suddenly, everything gets fixed because she brought a folder full of documents? No, Margaret said calmly. Nothing gets fixed quickly. Trust doesn't work that way. The room grew quiet again. Then Oliver spoke up. Can we still see Grandma? His simple question cut through the tension more clearly than any adult argument. Daniel looked at Emily. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she slowly sank back into her chair. I don't know, she admitted. It was the first honest sentence she had spoken all evening. Margaret folded her hands on the table. I'm not asking to replace you, she said softly. Emily looked up. I'm asking to exist. Daniel finally pushed his chair back and stood. We need help, he said. Emily frowned. What kind of help? Family counseling. Emily shook her head immediately. You think therapy is going to solve this? No, Daniel said. But pretending nothing happened definitely won't. Emily looked around the table. Her parents, her husband, her children, and the woman she had spent years trying to erase. For the first time, she seemed unsure of what to do next. Finally, she exhaled slowly. Fine. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't an apology. But it was something. That night ended quietly. Margaret left shortly afterward, taking the envelope with her. The evidence had served its purpose. Now the real work would begin. 6 months later, the garden behind Margaret's small house was filled with laughter. Sophie ran between the flower beds chasing a butterfly while Oliver crouched near a patch of roses, examining a ladybug with intense concentration. Margaret sat on a wooden bench, watching them. The air smelled of fresh grass and early summer. The past 6 months had not been easy. Family counseling had forced conversations none of them had ever wanted to have. Old insecurities surfaced. Arguments happened.
Tears were shed. But slowly, things began to change.
Emily attended every session, sometimes reluctantly, sometimes angrily, but she came. Daniel learned to speak up instead of quietly avoiding conflict. And the children, most importantly, finally had open access to their grandmother. Letters arrived without disappearing. Phone calls connected without interference. Visits happened when they were planned. Not everything was perfect. Trust, once broken, takes time to rebuild. But progress had been made. Sophie suddenly ran over to Margaret. "Grandma, look what I found." She held out a small feather. Margaret smiled. "It's beautiful." Oliver walked over next, holding the volcano book Margaret had given him months earlier. "I'm starting a new science project," he said proudly. "About earthquakes." Margaret chuckled. "Then we have a lot of reading to do." Across the yard, Emily stepped out onto the back porch. For a moment, she simply watched the scene. Then she walked toward them.
She stopped beside the bench.
"Daniel will be home soon," she said. Margaret nodded. Emily hesitated. "I added something to the photo album," she said. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Emily continued. "A section about your travels and teaching career." Margaret looked at her. Emily shrugged slightly. The kids wanted to know more about it. Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "Thank you." Emily didn't reply, but she didn't look away either. It wasn't friendship. Not yet. But it was no longer hostility. And sometimes that was enough. As Sophie and Oliver returned to chasing butterflies, Margaret leaned back against the bench. Inside her desk drawer, the envelope still existed. She kept it there not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Truth, once revealed, changes the landscape of relationships. And sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that save a family from quietly falling apart. Margaret watched her grandchildren playing in the warm sunlight and felt a calm she hadn't known in years. The story wasn't perfect, but it was finally honest. And that, she believed, was where real families begin again.